Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In our continued discussion of American culture, we've been talking about the crisis of masculinity around the turn of the century in 1900. And in the previous lectures, we've talked about figures like Teddy Roosevelt and Eugene Sandow, who represented a new sort of man at that time. In this lecture, we're going to talk about one more example, who represents manhood from a slightly different perspective, that of the magician and escape artist, Harry Houdini. Like Roosevelt and Sandow, Houdini represents an approach to masculinity in this period of the crisis of masculinity, but from a different approach. While Sandow lifted weights and twisted iron bars, Houdini demonstrated mastery over objects and material by escaping from them or making them disappear. A deft and skilled physical performer in his own right, Houdini offers a different take on the interpretation of manhood in this era. Houdini wasn't the greatest magician or sleight-of-hand performer of his era, but he was certainly the greatest escape artist, maybe ever. Experts still wonder at how he was able to achieve some of his escapes, even today. So it's important to note that his performances, which gripped the nation and the world, involve capture and escape, risk of injury and even death, helplessness and control. In every performance, Houdini achieved a metamorphosis from chained and helpless to powerful and dominant. Houdini was born as Erich Weiss in Budapest, Hungary in 1874. His family immigrated to Wisconsin when he was 2 years old, his father settling in as a Jewish rabbi in Appleton. Within a decade, the Weiss family slipped into the challenges that afflicted many immigrants. His father lost his job and began a series of attempts at putting food on the table, working as a butcher and itinerant worker, trying to care for a family with 7 children. Eventually, the family moved to New York, where after several more years his father died, working to the end in a garment factory. So Houdini, like Sandow and many others, exemplified the rags-to-riches ideal. His attraction to escape was evidenced early in life. At age 12, he ran away from home, surviving in Milwaukee for 3 months, working as a shoeshine boy. He eventually returned home, but we see an early inclination for escape. Houdini's interest in magic, too, was sparked when he was a boy, when he saw a magic show with his parents. The magician, named Dr. Lin, chopped apart a man's body on stage, only to have the repaired man appear moments later. In an age in which workplace accidents and amputations were common, the illusion spoke to many fears of the age. It struck a powerful chord with the boy in the crowd, who had no idea the mutilation was an illusion. He was terrified and mystified, and thereafter, working with his brothers and friends, practiced tricks endlessly until he became proficient. He also trained for a time in acrobatics and other circus routines, becoming a well-built, powerful, and flexible athlete in his own right. Another important turning point came for Houdini in reading the memoirs of the great French conjurer Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin, called by some the father of modern magic. Robert Houdin blended techniques he learned in the Far East with others to create a spectacular act filled with unexplainable illusions. Houdini read and reread the book, memorizing its pages and ultimately adopting his name as his own. Robert Houdin became, in Houdini's mind, the dashing, daring, independent father he never had. Houdini wanted to be the same way. Houdini was always fascinated with magic and the art of escape, which created for him a more potent sense of masculinity. Houdini was very close to his mother and had a problematic relationship with his father. While not exactly an absentee father, he toiled long hours at thankless jobs, and Houdini didn't hold him in the highest regard. In magic, he saw a craft that was empowering. He could create his own reality, toy with others' perceptions, and ease his own anxieties by seizing control of situations. In 1891, Eric Weiss performed his first great trick. He disappeared, replaced by Harry Houdini. He threw off the name that reflected his Jewish heritage, his immigrant background, and his disappointing childhood. He adopted the name of a powerful magician, and with it, a confident and powerful personality. For several years, Houdini worked the vaudeville circuit, with some combination of his friends and brothers. Always working with men, he never really struck a chord that fully connected with audiences. In 1894, he met the woman who would become his wife, Bess, and she immediately became his partner in his act. As a diminutive woman, she completely changed the onstage dynamic. Now, Houdini became a powerful, dominant man. Before, he was always overshadowed by his usually larger male partners. With his new partner, Houdini found his first hit. It was a trick called metamorphosis, in which he was placed in a bag and stuffed into a coffin-like box. 3 seconds later, the box was opened, and instead of him, it was Bess who came out of the bag. Not only was the trick stunning visually, but it also brought in a kind of gender play that we've discussed in other popular vaudeville acts of the day. Viewers imagined, we can suppose, both of the Houdinis wriggling around in the bag as they changed places. With this amazing trick, Houdini's reputation began to grow. Still, Houdini was several years away from hitting it big. He and Bess traveled the minor league vaudeville circuit, worked stages in bars and saloons, toured with a circus or two, and practiced their craft. Houdini worked tirelessly, perfecting old tricks and learning new ones, always inching closer to real fame and success. The breakthrough came in 1899, when he was discovered by a man named Martin Beck. Beck was the West Coast's answer to Keith and Albee, who controlled the East Coast vaudeville syndicate. Beck controlled the Orpheum circuit, which stretched from Chicago to San Francisco. Beck saw Houdini perform in a bar in Minnesota and signed him shortly thereafter. He also urged Houdini to drop the magic and parlor tricks and focus on his escape tricks. Houdini's stardom was about to soar. The act that made Houdini famous was his handcuff escapes. Now solidly established and prominently featured as an escape artist, the most popular part of the show involved him being put in handcuffs and quickly escaping from them. At first, he would retreat behind a curtain. Soon, he would pop out of the cuffs right in front of the crowd. He allowed viewers to inspect and put on the cuffs to confirm that they were solid. Eventually, he even allowed spectators to bring their own cuffs, which he still popped out of with ease. The gauntlet was thrown. Police companies began arriving with their own cuffs, from which Houdini quickly escaped. These impossible escapes, and the ease with which he accomplished them, soon made Houdini a national star. Houdini became a challenge to law enforcement across the West, who served only to augment his fame, binding him in their strongest cuffs, leg irons, chains, and other restraints. They were humiliated time and again as Houdini threw them all off with ease. In June 1899 in San Francisco, Houdini's notoriety reached new highs as he answered a challenge from a fellow escape artist named Professor Benzon, who claimed to know how Houdini accomplished his escapes, namely by hiding a handful of different keys in his mouth or on his body. Houdini arrived and insisted that he be bound completely naked by the authorities, and his mouth was even glued shut. Doctors examined him and determined it was utterly impossible for him to have access to any keys or objects. Within minutes, Houdini had removed all the restraints and held aloft the various sets of cuffs intertwined. The utter impossibility of the feat launched his stardom even higher. Not long after, he challenged an insane asylum to bind him in a straitjacket, from which he quickly escaped. These now became stock elements in his performances: nudity, police shackles, handcuffs, and straitjackets. By 1900, he was an international star. He traveled to jails all over the country, and in 1900 took his act to Europe. While he couldn't appear fully nude on stage, there were many photographs of him in a shackled state while naked, and he would appear publicly as close to naked as was allowed, then be taken backstage to complete the process from which he would achieve his escape. As an added element, he took to escaping from jail cells, often while police forces purported to keep an eye on him. Houdini toured in Europe for the next 5 years, banking huge sums of money before returning to the United States in 1905. Upon his return, he performed his most unbelievable escape yet. In Washington, D.C., he challenged the police of the 10th Precinct to lock him in their most secure cell. He was searched, bound, shackled, and locked behind impenetrable walls. The police gathered outside, exchanging looks and making wagers. 18 minutes later, the stunned crowd noticed that Houdini, fully clothed, was walking in their midst. He later claimed that he was out of the cell within the first minute. In another stunning stunt, Houdini was locked in a maximum security cell, totally naked. Minutes later, not only did Houdini appear freed from the cell, but he had also switched the other inmates in the wing into different cells. There are many other stories like this. Houdini, like Sandow, was perfectly suited to his times. His act drew massive attention from live audiences, as well as the daily newspapers who clamored for sensational stories. And similar to Sandow, his body, often naked, became a subject of great curiosity and interest. Houdini's increasingly daring, dangerous, and provocative escapes were powerfully symbolic for Americans and immigrants. His chained, naked body at the mercy of the police or other authorities was reminiscent of countless others who felt powerless. His shackled limbs, and eventually performances when he was hung from the side of buildings or other structures, reminded some of slavery or lynchings. When he arrived to perform an escape, he was stripped, inspected, bent over, forced into awkward and painful positions, lashed and chained and locked up. In some of the searches, the most intense, he was even penetrated as every orifice was examined. And make no mistake, the authorities at every stop were trying to stop him. Each one wanted to be the first that could keep Houdini locked up. By being so subjugated, the bound and chained Houdini was feminized and weakened. And yet, magically, in every case he was transformed into a confident, brazen man, waving the tools of his captors in their faces. This powerful metamorphosis gripped citizens all over the world, who perhaps imagined as they watched or read about his exploits, throwing off their own shackles, whatever they might be. Men and women, young and old, immigrants and natives of every sort, drew inspiration from the transformation that Houdini undertook with each act. Having escaped from every imaginable variation on prison restraints, in 1906 and 7, Houdini turned his attention to other escapes that made him a legend. The new array of stunts were even more intimate than grand prison breaks, but they left audiences more awestruck than ever. In an act that evolved with every performance, he now allowed himself to be locked inside of all manner of boxes and containers, usually while already cuffed, shackled, or straitjacketed. These escapes took much longer than before, sometimes hours. When he finally appeared, liberated, the effort of the escape was always evident. He was exhausted, flushed, sometimes scratched and bloody. These escapes were, without question, real. He escaped from coffins, from water heaters, from glass tanks, and all manner of custom-contrived containers brought in by interested parties. He escaped from a zinc-lined piano box and from a brutal array of tires and chains devised by a tire company. After 40 minutes, 50 minutes, or even hours, he appeared outside the restraints, weary and worn. By besting representatives of every imaginable organization of the age, Houdini carried forward the metaphor of masculine strength. For workers in the many factories of companies who challenged him, Houdini became a champion, humiliating and defeating their employers. Workers who were underpaid, toiled long hours under dangerous and harsh conditions, drew a sense of empowerment and pleasure at seeing Houdini defeat even their most devilish entrapments. Eventually, feeling pressure to constantly outdo himself, Houdini's act began to turn to daredevil performances. In the final years of his career, Houdini added all manner of death-defying challenges and escapes to his repertoire. He performed dozens of bridge jumps, being thrown from a bridge while bound and shackled, only to free himself in the waters below. It is in this stage of his career that he introduced his two most famous acts, the Chinese water torture cell and the aerial straitjacket release. Beginning in 1907, he undertook these increasingly dangerous acts, described in an article he published called Nearly Dying for a Living. He understood that nothing attracted a crowd so readily as a man attempting something that could end in death. A popular preliminary phase was his milk can escape, as he escaped from cuffs and shackles while locked in a large milk can filled with water, or milk or beer, depending on the show. This trick evolved into the Chinese water torture cell, in which he was immersed head first in a large glass tank, with his feet bound at the top of the tank. Once he was locked in, a large sheet obstructed the audience's view, and several minutes later, a soaked Houdini would appear, safe and sound, on top of the tank. Such tricks led to his most famous and popular stunt, the aerial straitjacket escape. In this stunt, he would be bound in a straitjacket, then strung up by his feet from the side of a building, a crane, the mast of a ship, or some other high place. While hanging upside down, he would liberate himself from the straitjacket. By the 19-teens, his career began to slow down. He was grief-stricken at the death of his mother in 1913, and emotionally was beginning to wear down. His body as well had suffered a great deal over his many stunts. He continued to perform, but gradually shifted his attention to acting. While never a star, he earned a respectable income as an actor from 1918 to 1923. He continued his escapes, but did fewer and fewer shows, and he also began to reintroduce traditional magic and sleight-of-hand tricks in his act. On October 22, 1926, Houdini was visited by several students after a performance at McGill University, one of whom asked if Houdini could take a punch to the abdomen. Houdini resisted, but likely would have accepted the challenge. As he went to rise, but before he could prepare for the blow, the student threw 5 or 6 hard punches to his gut. For the remainder of his life, only about a week, Houdini was in terrific pain. He performed another few shows before collapsing 3 days later. In surgery, doctors discovered a ruptured appendix and much internal damage. He died 6 days later. His death, and particularly the nature of it, having been felled by a cheap sucker punch, shocked the world. Despite the profound vulnerability it revealed, it did not detract from the achievements of his life. As much as Sandow had done, Houdini reinforced the power and the masculinity of man, overcoming pain, confinement, and torture to stand triumphant over his captors. In our next lecture, the final one of this period, we'll examine a few more aspects of popular culture in the Progressive Era.